thank you all for joining us over Zoom this Friday. As I said, we are delighted to have the Vilas Distinguished Achievement Professor of History from the University of Wisconsin here with us today, Francine Hirsch. Professor Hirsch's first book, Empire of Nations, Ethnographic Knowledge and the Making of the Soviet Union, examined the role of ethnographers and other former imperial experts in the formation of the Soviet Union. It has become a standard on syllabi all around the country. And her second book, which is what she'll be discussing today, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, A New History of the International Military Tribunal After World War II, published last year, presents the first complete history of the Nuremberg Trials. I am delighted to be in a position to announce, having just been let know yesterday of this news, that Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg has been awarded the AWSS, the Association for Women in Slavic Studies Helt Prize for the best book by a woman identifying scholar in any area of Slavic, East European, and Eurasian studies in 2021. Those who have read the book already will know Hirsch as a sure-handed guide in telling a story that spans continents and realms of activity, from justice to diplomacy to political culture. Hirsch makes several major analytical interventions, examining, as she puts it in the introduction, why the Soviets were essential to the achievement of justice at Nuremberg and why they were forgotten. Highlighting two distinct truths about this process. First, that illiberal states participated in the formation of international law, and second, that international justice is political. Among other things, this is also a deft work of narrative and an unassuming but utterly gripping read. I, for one, felt as though I were in the room at Nuremberg. And so with that, I would like to turn the floor over to Dr. Hirsch. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me here today, Anne, and thank you for the introduction. It's great to be at the Jordan Center, even if virtually, right? And today is actually, it's a really big anniversary. Today marks the 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg verdicts and the closing of the trials. And so I think this makes it an especially fine time to talk about Nuremberg, to revisit its history and to reflect also on its lessons and its legacy. So what I'll do today is I'll begin by presenting an overview of the book, outlining its four main arguments. And along the way, I'll do two short readings just to give you a sense of things, a feel for things. And at the very end, I'll share some images. So let's begin then. The International Military Tribunal, or IMT, took place from November 20th, 1945 to October 1st, 1946 at the Palace of Justice in occupied Germany. This was the first of the Nuremberg trials, and it would end up being the only four-power one. The United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, the four major Allied powers, tried 22 former Nazi leaders, people like Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, Joachim von Ribbentrop, Wilhelm Keitel, for conspiracy, crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. They also tried 6 Nazi organizations, including the Gestapo and the SS. But I want to actually begin today by taking us back to the summer of 1945, the summer before Nuremberg, and by reading a passage from chapter 2 of my book. And I wanted to set the scene here for you. American, British, French, and Soviet representatives are about to meet in London to negotiate the IMT's framework, to put together what will soon known as the London Agreement and the Nuremberg Charter. Robert H. Jackson, the Supreme Court Associate Justice, who will represent the United States in these discussions, and then later in the IMT, let's just say that he's less than thrilled to be cooperating with the Soviets. Okay, so here goes. Robert H. Jackson would have liked nothing more than to move forward without the Soviets, whom he was already regarding as the Achilles heel of the entire plan for a four-power tribunal. He was learning more by the day from the OSS and other intelligence sources about Soviet actions during the war. At a June 11th meeting with American religious leaders, Jackson had shared his anxiety about potential problems arising during the trial as a result of the Soviet Union's invasions of Poland and Finland in 1939. Now, the Soviet Union could not exactly be uninvited or excluded from participating in the prosecution of the former Nazi leaders. Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov had been the first to propose an international tribunal. And the Soviet lawyer, Aron Trainin, had provided key arguments about the Nazi conspiracy and about the illegality of aggressive war. But Jackson worried that the Soviets would undermine the tribunal's legitimacy just by participating, and he was beginning to ponder ways of minimizing their impact. It would be so much easier if they simply didn't show up. The Soviets, they had no intention of not showing up. In June 1945, Soviet leaders were still gaining a full realization of what their country had endured during the war. The Soviet Union's losses were almost beyond belief. Some 27 million Soviet citizens had perished. That's 1 out of every 7 people. 2/3 of the dead were civilians. The world did not seem to grasp the sheer magnitude of Soviet losses. An international tribunal would provide the Soviets with a public forum for a reckoning. It would expose Nazi crimes and, Soviet leaders believed, would facilitate Moscow's claims for material compensation and German labor. The stakes for the Soviet Union were thus extremely high. Well, of course, the Soviets did show up in London, and then they went on to play a critical role in Nuremberg. But in the United States, Nuremberg has been remembered chiefly as an American story. In the most popular accounts, Jackson is held up as the hero of the moment. The TV docudrama Nuremberg, I don't know if any of you have seen this, but it's a great example. Jackson, who's played by a young Alec Baldwin, is the driving force behind the entire trial. The British and the French in this docudrama, they play noble but supporting roles. Meanwhile, the Soviets, they come off as crude and vengeful, and in some cases, in some scenes, as no better than the Nazi defendants. This version of the Nuremberg story has persisted for decades, in different versions, of course, and the Soviet contribution has gone largely or underappreciated. And I would say that there are several reasons for this, good reasons, including limited access to the former Soviet archives, right, especially during the decades of the Cold War. And then, of course, there's also the fact that the 12 subsequent Nuremberg trials, including the Einsatzgruppen trial and the judges trial, right, memorialized in that famous movie, they were carried out by the United States alone. But there's also a deeper issue at play, a discomfort with historical complexity. The Soviet role in the Nuremberg trials, it was complicated. The Soviets were carrying out deportations in Poland and in Hungary, even as the IMT was hearing evidence against the Nazis. There were episodes involving the Soviets at Nuremberg that everyone wanted to forget, such as the Soviet effort to use the IMT to blame one of their own atrocities on the Nazis. This, of course, is the Katyn massacre of thousands of Polish prisoners of war, Polish officers. In a more general sense, too, though, the contribution of Joseph Stalin's Soviet Union to the IMT upends the myth of Nuremberg as fully grounded in liberal ideas about justice and the law. So I argue in my book, and I'll argue here today, that we need the full story. The real Nuremberg story, yes, it's messy. It's also incredibly interesting, and it's necessary because Nuremberg still matters. For some, Nuremberg still remains a gold standard for international justice. For others, it's an appalling example of victor's justice that should never be repeated. But if Nuremberg is going to offer meaningful lessons at all, we need to understand what actually happened. So my book, Soviet Judgment at Nuremberg, it aims to bring the Soviets fully into the picture. It draws on evidence from 5 Moscow archives to do so. And the material, the evidence, it includes things like protocols of the meetings of 2 secret Soviet Nuremberg commissions that were based back in Moscow. It includes things like secret telegrams that were sent from Nuremberg to Moscow and back. And many of those materials are from the archive of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. It includes letters, diaries, surveillance reports from Soviet writers, diplomats, editors, and others in Nuremberg who are acting as kind of informal informants, right? That give us a sense of the ups and downs of the trials and of the day-to-day life of the members of the Soviet delegation. We get a sense through those materials of things like their impressions of the city, the food, the nightlife, what the members of the Soviet delegation thought when they first saw the defendants. The archival materials include things too, like lists of possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution and their depositions. And it also includes things like marked up copies of documents, like the indictment and the judgment that the Soviet delegation secretly smuggled back to Moscow for review and approval. And those are incredible documents because you can see Molotov and Stalin's handwriting on them in cases. All right. We also see the tremendous Soviet contribution to the trial. So it's not just the Soviet role, it's their contribution to the trials, and also the ways in which Soviet participation in the trials really did threaten from the beginning to undermine the IMT's legitimacy. The book also aims to use the Soviet peace and the Soviet archives combined with other sources to tell a richer story about the Nuremberg trials as a whole, right? An international story. Because looking at the relationship among all four powers, it really opens things up. There were, of course, 4 prosecution teams in Nuremberg: American, British, Soviet, and French. There were 4 main judges, one representing each country of the prosecution. And the relationships among the prosecutors and among the judges and between the prosecutors and the judges, both in the courtroom and more informally, those relationships are highly revealing. We see clashes about the meaning of justice and the compromises that were made on all sides. We also see the importance of the nightlife and the parties with the endless flow of alcohol. There was a lot of drinking in Nuremberg for keeping things congenial and sometimes just for keeping the trials on track. And we see too how Nuremberg became an early front of the Cold War and how this, to take things back around, affected the telling of the Nuremberg story that we get in all those docudramas and memoirs and other secondary sources. So I want to just say now a bit about the narrative arc of the book before turning to its main arguments. The book starts during the darkest days of the war. It covers the road to Nuremberg, focusing in on the contentious negotiations about the Nuremberg Charter and about the indictment which set out the charges. It then retells the story of the trials, capturing the drama of the prosecution's case, the defense case, and the judgment, which to the dismay of the Soviets resulted in several acquittals. It ends with a chapter on Nuremberg's aftermath, looking at its legacy in the post-war period. Now, I don't know if I should answer that or not. I was in the background. I'm actually going to take it off the hook so it doesn't do it again. Excuse me. All right, here we go. Well, my aim, that's the thing from doing it at home. My aim with the book was to tell a good story and to introduce readers to a new cast of characters. We see Nuremberg and the trials through the eyes of people like the Soviet documentary filmmaker Roman Karman and the political cartoonist Boris Efimov and other Soviet correspondents. And a number of them, people like Karman, had been embedded with the Red Army during the war and had actually witnessed the liberation of the concentration camps. And they bring those experiences with them into the Nuremberg courtroom. We also see the Soviets and the Americans and the French and the British getting to know each other. And here I'll just say that Jackson's unpublished diaries, which are close to home at the Library of Congress, right? Well, closer than Moscow anyway, they're full of all kinds of observations. Jackson judged one dinner that he hosted at Claridge's in London during that summer of 1945, and I'll quote him here, to have been very successful from the point of view of cultivating better relations, even as he noted that the Soviets drank very little, which was suspicious, and were somewhat scornful of the yellow liquid claimed to be vodka, which was served. We also see through these materials the outsized role of Andrei Vashinsky, deputy foreign minister and the head of one of the Soviet Union's secret Nuremberg commissions. Vishinsky had earlier been the chief prosecutor in the Moscow trials of 1936 to 1938. Major show trials which Stalin had used to take down his political enemies. And although Vashinsky spent spent just 1 week in Nuremberg, his influence was constant. Okay, at least for the Soviet delegation. We'll get back to that in a little bit too. So I want to turn now to the book's 4 main arguments. Argument 1. Without the Soviets, Nuremberg likely never would have happened. The Soviets were the one who kind of got things going. They took up the question of Nazi criminality early in the war, prompted by the brutality of the Nazi assault and occupation. In April 1942, Foreign Minister Molotov published his 3rd note on German atrocities, citing evidence that the burning of villages and the massacre of civilians were part of a deliberate German plan. It was also around this time that Soviet leaders asked lawyers at Moscow's Institute of Law to evaluate the international law perspective on reparations. 6 months later, in October 1942, Molotov publicly called for the convening of a special international tribunal. That was the phrase he used, and invited all interested governments to cooperate in bringing Hitler, Goering, Hess, and other Nazi leaders to justice. Now, the United States and Britain, they were slow to come on board. The US government worried about reprisals against Allied prisoners of war. The British argued that the crimes of the Nazi leaders were far too serious for a trial, and they pushed instead for punishment by executive decree without a legal process. And so the Soviets, they went down their own path. They created their own war crime commission, the Extraordinary State Commission, and they were also the only Allied power that did not participate in the United Nations War Crimes Commission, the UNWCC, which met in London beginning in October 1943. But even as the Soviets went down their own path, the Soviet lawyer Aaron Chainin from Moscow's Institute of Law influenced the international discussion about war crimes through his writings. Chainin argued that the planning and waging of wars of aggression, wars of conquest, should be punished as crimes against peace. And Chainin coined this term. He also argued that Nazi leaders could and should be tried for participating in a criminal conspiracy. And he challenged the defense of just following orders, the defense of superior orders. Chainin initially set out his ideas in a report for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This report was then turned into a book, The Criminal Responsibility of the Hitlerites. And one of the things I was able to see in the archives, first in the Moscow archives, the different drafts of this report and how it's discussed in Moscow, but then through the US archives, I was able to trace how it traveled. So the book made its way across Europe to London, where it was translated into English and discussed by the members of the UNWCC. It then crossed the Atlantic to the United States, where it landed at the War Department Special Projects Branch and then at the White House. Now, this is important. Chainin was not the only lawyer arguing for the criminality of aggressive war, right? This is sort of in the air at the time. But whereas many European and American lawyers expressed unease about ex post facto or retroactive law, the Soviets had no such reservations. And Chainin's formula for this ends up becoming extremely important. After the victory, when the other Allied powers came around to the idea of an international tribunal, Chainin was one of the 2 representatives that the Soviets sent to London to negotiate the Nuremberg Charter. Crimes against peace was one of the 3 categories of crimes set out in the Charter's Article 6, along with war crimes and crimes against humanity. I'll note that a 4th category of crimes was later added in the indictment at the urging of the Americans, and this was conspiracy. Okay. Argument 2, kind of move on to that. The Soviets, they had no idea what they had set in motion. They had no idea what they were getting into, and were actually greatly handicapped on the international stage by the constraints of Stalinism. The Soviets took Nazi guilt as a given. They were expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. They expected to use the IMT to demonstrate Nazi guilt and to tell a story about Soviet suffering and heroism. Soviet expectations and aims shaped their choice of personnel for Nuremberg. Almost all of the members of the Soviet legal team were connected to the Soviet show trials of the 1930s. The Soviet judge, Yona Nikitchenko, had been a judge in the Moscow trials. The Soviet chief prosecutor, Roman Rudenko, had served as the prosecutor for show trials in the 1930s in Ukraine. And I'll note too that Rudenko also then served as the prosecutor in a June 1945 show trial held in Moscow of 16 leaders of the Polish underground movement. And again, these show trials, they turned reality on their head, right? Soviet assistant prosecutors had very similar show trial credentials. Now, the Soviets thought that the victors would control the script at Nuremberg, just as the prosecution had done in the Soviet show trials and in the Soviet Union's own war crimes trials that it had already been having, right? Like the Kharkov trial of December 1943. They certainly did not expect that the defendants would be allowed to take the stand in their own defense, or that the defendants would be allowed to call witnesses. They even were surprised by the idea that the defendants would be allowed to select their own attorneys. The Soviets were so confident of the victors controlling the script that they insisted on including the Katyn massacre, one of their own war crimes, in the indictment as a German war crime. Now, Soviet insistence on this seems completely reckless, right, in retrospect. But the Soviets really believed that the defendants would not be allowed to challenge their evidence or call witnesses. The Soviets were so confident, too, of the victors controlling the script that they initially didn't bother to tell their chief prosecutor, Rudenko, about the secret protocols to the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939, in which Hitler and Stalin had plotted out the conquest and division of Poland and the Baltic states. They assumed that Rudenko didn't need to know, even though Ribbentrop, the former German foreign minister who had signed this pact, was one of the defendants. The secret protocols became an issue at the very start of the trials in November 1945, prompting Andrei Vashinsky's one and only visit to Nuremberg. And I'll do my other reading here, the second one from chapter 5, just to give you a feeling for this, for a sense of the visit and what was at stake. And it's important to remember now that the Western powers, they don't know about Vishinskys' secret commission. He's visiting Nuremberg in his capacity as Soviet deputy foreign minister. Okay. On Sunday, November 25th, Andrei Vashinsky came to town. His arrival created a state of heightened alert among the members of the Soviet delegation. The Soviet prosecutors and judges all knew that they were in Nuremberg to do Vashinsky's bidding, and that their fates rested in his hands. Even the Western prosecutors were stirred up. According to U.S. Assistant Prosecutor Telford Taylor, the U.S. delegation had regarded Vashinsky as an ominous figure because of his role in the Moscow trials. Everyone eyed him with curiosity. What exactly was his business? How would he behave? Vishinsky had come to Nuremberg primarily to ensure that the Soviet prosecution successfully repelled a push for the tribunal to consider highly sensitive evidence about the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. The instigator of this request was Alfred Seidel, the defense attorney for Hans Frank and a former member of the Nazi Party, who claimed to have dug up some documents about the pact's secret protocols. The evening after his arrival, Vashinsky called a meeting with the members of the Soviet delegation. Many issues were discussed. At the end of the meeting, Vashinsky broached the most sensitive issue of all, a request that had been made by Jackson. A few weeks earlier, Jackson had asked his British, French, and Soviet colleagues to write up secret memoranda detailing their country's war crimes in anticipation of potential allegations from the defense. Back in Moscow, Soviet leaders had put their own spin on Jackson's request. Without admitting to any wrongdoing, they had made a list of taboo topics that they wanted kept out of the courtroom. Vishinsky now presented this list to the Soviet delegation. Not surprisingly, this highly secret list, which had been typed out on a single sheet of paper, included a number of items about Soviet-German relations, including the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact of 1939 and all questions relating to it. It also included more general topics, such as Soviet-Polish relations. Vishinsky now ordered Rudenko to reach a verbal agreement with the French, British, and American prosecutors to steer clear of questions that their countries did not want raised by the accused. Notably, Vashinsky did not give Rudenko permission to share a physical copy of the Soviet taboo list with any of the Western prosecutors. Once a copy was in circulation, the Soviets would lose the shield of plausible deniability. Vashinskys' visit was an occasion, even to those who were unaware of his direct involvement with the trials. Jackson gave a dinner at the Grand Hotel in his honor, and Vashinsky went there directly from his meeting with the Soviet delegation. At one point in the evening, Vashinsky rose and proposed a toast to the defendants. May their paths lead straight from the courthouse to the grave. Everyone had drained their glasses before the translation was finished. And the American judges were appalled to hear that they had drunk to the deaths of the accused. This was perhaps the only time the Soviets did not mind the sluggish pace of interpretation from Russian into English. Vashinsky visibly enjoyed the moment. Okay, well, this is sort of one of my favorite scenes. I love the drama of the story, but I also think that it beautifully illustrates the ways in which Stalinism left the Soviet delegation unprepared for the international stage. We see the primacy put on secrecy before and during the trials. The fact that Vishinsky has to go to Nuremberg now to brief the Soviet delegation about things that one would assume that maybe they would already know, right? But they don't. We get a glimpse of the problems with interpretation. And the fact was that the Soviet delegation didn't have enough able interpreters in Nuremberg for a whole number of reasons, including the Ministry of Internal Affairs' reluctance to clear people who knew any foreign languages for travel abroad. There's also the fact that the Soviets had shot a number of German speakers during the war, but we'll talk more about that later too. We also see here Moscow's expectations for centralized control. Moscow's demand for centralized control was an issue for the entire course of the trials. And I'll just linger for a little bit here. The Soviet prosecutors and judges had far less independence than their American, British, and French counterparts. Vishinsky's secret commission, which included the heads of all of the branches of the Soviet security apparatus, they were supposed to oversee the Soviet delegation and the Soviet case from afar. Rudenko and Nikitchenko had to clear each and every decision, large and small, with Soviet leaders. They smuggled documents out through secret channels to Vashinsky in Moscow. Vashinsky then sent them around to other commission members and then further up the chain of command to Molotov and sometimes to Stalin. Now, the paper trail that this produced, it's just incredible, right? The Moscow archives have marked up drafts of all kinds of documents, including the judgment. And it's worth mentioning that the judgment was not supposed to circulate at all. Throughout the trials, the Soviet judges and prosecutors managed successfully to get these documents out of Nuremberg and to Moscow, but doing so usually didn't help them all that much. Smuggling documents to Moscow and back was a logistical nightmare. Documents sometimes got lost in transit. Instructions often arrived too late to be of real use. Meanwhile, Nikitchenko and Rudenko, the Soviet judge and chief prosecutor back in Nuremberg, they're deprived of the kind of flexibility that they need, right, to be able to effectively negotiate with representatives of the Western powers. They're often left scrambling. Okay, I'm going to move on now to argument 3 of the book. So argument 3. At Nuremberg, the Soviets presented powerful proof of what we now know as the Holocaust, and what at the time was talked about as Hitler's final solution. This Soviet contribution is often overlooked, in part because earlier Soviet war crimes trials, like the Kharkov trial, spoke of crimes against peaceful Soviet citizens, even when the victims were Jews. And in part because of the Soviet Union's anti-Semitic, anti-cosmopolitan campaign that was launched in the years after Nuremberg. At Nuremberg, though, the Soviet presentations on crimes against humanity included extensive evidence of the Nazi plan to exterminate Europe's Jews. Soviet assistant prosecutor Lev Smirnov introduced a number of shocking documents during the Soviet case, including a report from the commanders of Einsatzgruppe A, Death Squad A, bragging, and I'll quote here, about having fulfilled orders to eliminate the Jews to the fullest possible extent in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, including things like a Polish government report, and I'll quote again. It stated that 3 million Jews have been exterminated in Poland. Eyewitnesses for the Soviet prosecution also testified about the Nazi campaign to wipe out the Jews. Now, I'll note that the Soviets almost didn't send eyewitnesses to Nuremberg. The Soviet security police had been screening possible witnesses for the Soviet prosecution since November 1945, but Soviet leaders had been considering having the Soviet prosecution build its case on documents alone. But the Soviet prosecution, it went last, after the Americans, the British, and the French presented their cases. And while the Soviets struggled at Nuremberg for some of the reasons just discussed, right, they also adapted and made course corrections along the way. They made the decision to send eyewitnesses in January 1946, when Rudenko was back in Moscow for the holiday break, meeting with Soviet leaders, including Stalin. The Soviet prosecution ultimately called 7 eyewitnesses to testify about Nazi war crimes and crimes against humanity. And I think that this testimony ends up being the most compelling and memorable part of their case, and really some of the most memorable parts of the trial as well. 2 of those eyewitnesses, Avraham Sutzkever and Samuel Rajman, were selected specifically to testify about Nazi crimes against the Jews. Sutzkever, a Yiddish poet, had fled the Vilna ghetto in September 1943 and joined a group of partisans in the forests of northwestern Belarusia. In March 1944, the Soviets had staged a rescue operation, airlifting him and his wife, Fredke, out of German-occupied territory. In Moscow, Sutzkever worked with the writer Ilya Ehrenberg and other members of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee to compile evidence of the Nazi murder of Jews throughout the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. The Soviet prosecution called Sutzkever to the witness box in late February 1946, and his testimony is harrowing. He spoke about the Einsatzgruppen and about the systematic killing of the Jews in Vilna. He also recounted the murder of his newborn son by German soldiers in the ghetto hospital. Sutzkever was the only witness to remain standing in the witness box, as if, he then wrote in his diary, it had been a matter of saying Kaddish, the Jewish prayer for the dead. He considered it a matter of Jewish destiny, he also wrote, that he, a Yiddish poet, had, and I'll quote him here, had survived to Judge Rosenberg and Franken-Nuremberg, and through them, all who had adhered to their ideology. Sutzkever, a Jew and a partisan, understood that he was speaking on behalf of the Jewish people and on behalf of the Soviet people. His testimony was critical for the Soviets, as was the evidence presented by the Soviet prosecution. They told the story of the annihilation of the Jews while integrating it into a larger narrative about the wartime suffering of the entire Soviet people in the German-occupied East. So I'll move on now to argument 4 of the book. So the Nuremberg Trials became an early front of the Cold War, and understanding Nuremberg as such gives us an important perspective on the post-war movement for human rights. Now, we often tend to think of Nuremberg as a struggle between the prosecution and the defense, right? And of course that was true, but it was also a contest among the countries of the prosecution for power and for influence and for control over the narrative of the war. And the Soviets and the Americans in particular were on a collision course from the start. Now, while the prosecution presented its case from November 1945 through February 1946, tensions were mostly kept under wraps. Then in March 1946, the Cold War blew into the Nuremberg courtroom. On March 5th, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave his Iron Curtain speech, right, as we now call it, in Fulton, Missouri, calling for Anglo-American resistance to Soviet tyranny. The very next day, the defense case began in Nuremberg. And when the Soviets got to the courtroom, there were copies of the US Army newspaper Stars and Stripes scattered everywhere with the headline, "Unite to Stop Russians." The defense attorneys were holding up copies for their clients to read over their shoulders. All of this energized the defense, who upped their effort to drive a wedge further between the Soviets and the Western powers. And the defense had great success in the weeks and months that followed. Goering insisted that Germany had launched a preventive war against the Soviet Union and not a war of aggression. Ribbentrop riveted the courtroom with his description of the secret protocols to the German-Soviet Non-Aggression Pact. He argued that if Germany was guilty of crimes against peace, then the Soviets certainly were too. One Soviet informant writing home after Ribbentrop's testimony expressed alarm that the Soviet Union, and I'll quote his telegram here, that the Soviet Union, a country of victors, had gone to Nuremberg to prosecute the fascists and had instead become the object of their provocative attacks. He blamed the tactics of the defense, but he also blamed the influence of the international situation. That's again another quote from the telegram. This turn of events had taken the entire Soviet delegation by surprise. The prosecutors had agreed early on Jackson's initiative, right, to work together to keep awkward topics out of the courtroom. And the Soviets, by the way, they referred to this as their gentleman's agreement. But, and this is significant, the Soviets had not understood that the Western judges had not signed on to this. The Western judges were deeply worried about allegations of victor's justice and about preserving the legitimacy of the trials. And let's face it, things like Vishinskys' quote didn't exactly help things there, right? I mean, his toast rather, you know. The Western judges ended up giving significant leeway to the defendants, much more than any of the prosecutors, including Jackson, had expected. The challenges to the Soviets during the defense case kept coming. Goering's attorney petitioned for witnesses to counter Soviet charges that German forces had carried out the Katyn massacre. And the Western judges, outvoting Nikitchenko, allowed 3 defense witnesses, along with 3 Soviet witnesses, to testify about Katyn. The defense witnesses ultimately cast enough doubt about the Soviet version of events that no mention of Katyn appeared in the judgment. Now, the after-hours socializing in Nuremberg, including tennis matches and pool parties and lots of drinking, right? All of this prevented things in Nuremberg during those months from completely falling apart. But back in Moscow, Soviet leaders interpreted all decisions by the judges that went against their interests after that, and there were many 3-to-1 votes against Nikitchenko as part of an Anglo-American anti-Soviet plot. In the end, Nuremberg was a disappointment for the Soviets, who never expected their own actions to be subject to scrutiny, and who were expecting guilty verdicts and hangings down the line. Which brings us back to the events of 75 years ago today, right, to the verdicts. The Soviets did not get all the verdicts and the sentences they wanted. 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death by hanging. 3 were acquitted. The others, including Hess, received prison sentences. Now, a number of things had led to these acquittals, including, I want to add, the tribunal's decision to reformulate the conspiracy charge at the end and to limit it to the planning and waging of aggressive war, to limit the conspiracy to crimes against peace. The verdicts for the organizations was also not as straightforward as the Soviets would have liked. The leadership core of the Nazi Party, the SS, and the Gestapo and SD, which were tried together, they were all declared to be criminal organizations, but they were deemed culpable only for crimes committed after the start of the war. The SA, the brown shirts, the Reich cabinet, and the general staff and high command, they were not found to be criminal organizations, right, within the bounds set out in the Nuremberg Charter. Notably, though, Even with these disappointments, the Soviets still wanted more four-power trials, especially of the industrialists who had financed Hitler. Many of them were in American custody, right? And that was really the only way to get at them. But the Americans were done with the Soviets after Nuremberg and had held the subsequent Nuremberg trials on their own. As a result of Nuremberg, the Cold War and the post-war movement for human rights became completely entangled. This in turn shaped and for a long time hampered subsequent deliberations in the United Nations and other institutions about turning the Nuremberg principles, as they came to be called, and which included the concepts of crimes against humanity and crimes against peace. It hampered the efforts to turn that into permanent international law and to create a permanent international criminal court. Okay. I want to conclude today by reflecting on Nuremberg's legacy. I worry sometimes that I'm telling a story that people really might not want to hear. The Nuremberg myth, the idea of Nuremberg as fully grounded in Western liberal ideas about justice and the law, right? The idea of Jackson out in front, that is an uplifting story after all. And Russia has its own version of the Nuremberg story, simplified in its own way, that does not include Katyn, of course, and that skirts the secret protocols, right? But I think that the more expansive Nuremberg story is important. It offers important lessons too about the perils as well as the possibilities of international cooperation. The IMT was not simply a result of Western leadership and liberal idealism. It involved endless negotiations and difficult compromises by representatives of four governments representing people that had had very different experiences of the war, right? And governments with different ideas about justice. And yes, the Cold War politicization of human rights, that's part of the Nuremberg story. And it helps explain why the promise of the Nuremberg principles has fallen short. The end of the Cold War did eventually see the founding of the International Criminal Court, but a number of powerful nations, including the United States and Russia, have regarded it and continue to regard it with suspicion or outright disdain. Concerns about the politicization of justice and state sovereignty, they've never gone away. But Nuremberg itself, it was a tremendous success story. Representatives from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, they came together, they managed to find common ground even as Cold War tensions flared. They created a comprehensive record of the crimes of the Third Reich and pushed forward the work of denazification. And that record, I would say, is absolutely critical that we have that record today. They set the precedent that launching a war of aggression was a criminally punishable act. And they sparked an international conversation about human rights that continues to this day within international institutions, but also at the grassroots level. Now, an international system or international institutions of any kind do not necessarily require governments to have the same ideals, right? Although that certainly helps. But they do require governments to believe that they have something to gain by participating. And that was the case at Nuremberg. On this 75th anniversary of the Nuremberg verdicts, the real and very messy story of the IMT, the achievements and the compromises, the highs and the lows, deserve still a thorough consideration. Thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hirsch, for this excellent overview of the book. I'm going to ask that for questions, if you have them.
Oh, and I have pictures I can show at the very end. I forgot about all that. So
do you want to wait until the very end, or would you like to show those now while people?
Yeah, why don't I show the slides while people formulate their questions? That's
so before you start in on that, let me just ask everyone, if you have a question, to please You don't have to type out the entire question in the chat, but if you could register that you have a question in the chat, that way I can have a list of people in order.
All right, here we are. Okay, so yeah, I just wanted to share some images, just again to give a sense of the feeling of where Nuremberg was and what things look like at the moment. And so here we have Nuremberg in the American zone of Germany and a photo of what the city looked like in the fall of 1945. This is an aerial shot of the Palace of Justice. And if you look in the back, you can see the four buildings coming out of the back of the building, kind of as spokes. And that's those are that's the compound of the Nuremberg prison. Here's the front of the building with the flags of the four countries of the prosecution flying high. We've got the defendants now in the dock, which I'll note they were seated according to their level of importance, as it was. So we have Goering and then Hess and then Ribbentrop down the line there. Here we have Robert H. Jackson and Alec Baldwin as Robert H. Jackson. I kind of love that image. So up on top, we have the political cartoonist, the artist Boris Efimov, and a couple of his caricatures of the German defendants. And Efimov sat sketching. He did these sketches while sitting in the courtroom and watching the trials. And he talks about that in his memoirs. And we have Goering and Ribbentrop. And these were part of a series called Fascist Beasts that was published in the Soviet newspaper Izvestia. These two were published in December 45. I love this one. Here's a photo of the Grand Hotel, that same Grand Hotel where Andrei Vashinsky gave his toast. And Roman Karman is there with some other Soviet correspondents. Karman himself is fourth from the left, and of course an American guard in the white hat there too. Another of my favorite photos, a reminder that Nuremberg was not all work, right? I mentioned all the alcohol there. They were doing other things too, like going to soccer games on the weekend. And here are some members of the Soviet delegation at a soccer game. And here, Karman is in this one too, fourth from the left. Here's some of the interpreters sitting in the area that was called they nicknamed it the aquarium in the Nuremberg courtroom. And for those of you who read Russian and want to know more about the interpreters and just some of the ins and outs of the trials, there's a great memoir that was written by the Soviet interpreter, Tatyana Stupnikova. Here's Andrei Vashinsky and in English language, so it's like translated into English so that everyone can read, right? An English language transcript of one of the Moscow trials right here. So, and here's Vashinsky leaning forward in the courtroom during that, watching the trials in the place for the distinguished guests while he was there during his November visit. Here we have the members of the Soviet delegation who were at the London conference in the summer before the trial, June 45, where they put together the Nuremberg Charter, and Aaron Trainin is with the mustache in the middle. To his right is Yona Nikitchenko. Now it's interesting, for the most part, these were Nikitchenko was slated originally to be the prosecutor, and they decided last minute to pull him as prosecutor and put him in as judge. But when he's there in London, they still think he's going to be prosecutor. And on the other side of Trainin is the translator, Oleg Trainovsky. Here's Trainin's pass, just to get a sense of what the passes were. There's lots of tight security. Roman Rudenko and Yona Nikitchenko, again, in the roles that they settled, they were officially then slated for chief prosecutor and judge. And another favorite photo of mine of Rudenko, and across from him is the Soviet deputy chief prosecutor, Yuri Pokrovsky. And this is early in the trials when the Americans are presenting their case. And the Americans went on far longer than anyone anticipated, especially the Soviets. I don't know, I just kind of feel some of the emotion in that photo, I think. Abraham Sutzkever, standing while giving his testimony in the witness box. That newspaper, Stars and Stripes, Unite to Stop Russians. And, and I mentioned this because they talk about it in the memoirs, right? It comes up in the Soviet memoirs. That's how we get the story about coming to the courtroom and the newspapers being there. And Goering in the witness box. And that's it, it's back to the end. So, okay, I will stop my share screen. Okay, great, thank you.
All right, we have some questions lined up here. Our first question is from Denise Volkov.
Hi, I hope you can hear me. I'm from Ukraine originally, but live in Winnipeg, Canada. Something that really fascinating talk. At the beginning of your talk, you mentioned one of the Russian, and I'm not sure, prosecutors or somebody from Russian delegation kind of talked about this being sort of about world peace, or you mentioned, like the importance of prosecution. And I link it to what right now Russia is doing in Ukraine with annexation of Crimea and the war they're waging in eastern Ukraine. Like, in what you found, is that, like, I guess I'm trying for myself find similarities between, what happened in Nuremberg and whether or not that can be used to prosecute Russia in the future for what they're doing in Ukraine right now. I know it's kind of a loaded question, but any comments would be appreciated, directly and indirectly answering this. Thank you.
So that's so super interesting. So I just want to say from the start, so Trainin was the lawyer who I talked about, who was writing about aggressive war being a crime and coming up with this idea of crimes against peace, right? But of course, the same time that he's doing that, the Soviets are committing crimes against peace. And so it's not where it's straightforward in terms of like good guys and bad guys here, right? He comes up with this language as a way of trying the Nazis and of trying Nazi leaders. But right. And the other thing that I want to say that this question again of all of the countries of the prosecution, when they sat down to write the Nuremberg Charter and the London Agreement, they were concerned about state sovereignty, right? It was actually the French who were the least concerned and who were pushing more for state sovereignty. That should not be as much of an issue. But they really limited crimes against peace, right? In particular, to be connected with the crime of waging an aggressive war. They only tried crimes against, they only in the end found people guilty of crimes against peace if it was connected with another crime, right? With waging an aggressive war. And also in terms of crimes against peace as well, they limited the Nuremberg Charter and the London Agreement just to the European Axis powers. So that was not supposed to go beyond that. Now, after Nuremberg, right, that's a whole nother story, because after Nuremberg, there are all kinds of discussions in the United Nations, and actually there's a range of different international organizations. And the object of the discussion is to talk about like what exactly, when we say there are these Nuremberg principles, crimes against peace, crimes against humanity, to what extent, how does state sovereignty come into play, right? And one of the reasons why the Soviet Union and the United States never ultimately like ratified the resistance, and not just them, I mean, Great Britain, other states as well, like resisted this idea of these ideas of Nuremberg being applied to other states, was because they didn't want their own leaders or citizens to have to go before an international tribunal. So, I mean, we have examples, of course. I don't want to spend too much, this could be a great long conversation about, again, like the Rwanda, Yugoslavia, again, how Nuremberg principles were used in other cases. But let's just say it's very difficult to try a state that has not been defeated, right? The Nuremberg principles like work best when you have a conquered state. That's how they were used at Nuremberg. Nuremberg was seen as a continuation of the war, right? It was an international military tribunal. And so that's the main, that's a big limitation, right? It's one of the problems of Nuremberg.
Thank you. All right, the next question is from Wyatt Miles, and I can read it. It's here. Why did the Soviets call Joseph Orbeli, the director of the Hermitage Museum in Leningrad, to testify at Nuremberg? Why particularly him for the subject of crimes against the humanity?
So Orbeli was called to, so it wasn't crimes against humanity. In that case, it was war crimes. And the category of war crimes included the destruction of cultural monuments. And so Orbeli, again, as the director of the Hermitage, one of the things that he was brought in to testify about was the destruction of cultural monuments. And he wasn't just the director, he was the director of the Hermitage, but then he was also brought in to serve on a number of commissions that were linked to the Extraordinary State Commission that went out to document the destruction of cultural monuments throughout the Soviet Union. And so his name was attached to a number of those reports. And so that was part of why they brought him in.
Thank you so much.
Sure.
Our next question is from Zineda Sipova.
Hi, thank you, Professor Hirsch, for this wonderful presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book. And I have a question about the Soviet delegation, and I think it's fascinating that many of them participated in the show trials before, and I'm curious about what happens when they come back from Nuremberg to the Soviet Union. Are there any implications for the Soviet judicial system, or what happens there? Are there like any lessons or any effects?
Thank you. So one of the things I tried to do with the book was to follow what happens to these members of the Soviet delegation later. Yonin Nikitchenko, the Soviet judge, ends up getting caught up, like he's charged with corruption. James Heinsohn has a really great book about the Soviet legal system where he talks a little bit about what happens to Nikitchenko and his fate. So he's accused of fraternizing with a Russian woman and gets caught up in a whole big scandal around that. Rudenko goes on to have, later under Khrushchev, goes on to have like a career as the Procurator General of the Soviet Union, right? So it's not a question of them bringing legal ideas. I mean, he ends up prosecuting a whole number of dissidents. And here, what I would say as well, Rudenko and some of the others, this language of Nuremberg, the language of crimes against peace, it becomes weaponized as well during the Cold War. And one of the things that you see, there's this really interesting moment later with Rudenko during the trial of Francis Gary Powers, right, the U-2 incident, when he's denouncing Powers before the court and when he's denouncing him before the media. What does he accuse Powers of? He accuses him of committing crimes against peace, of committing aggression, again, by going into Soviet airspace. So that's kind of one legacy as well. A number of people involved with the trials, some of the members of the trial who were involved in the security apparatus, some of them end up being shot in the 40s as well. There are some trials. And so I would say it's not straightforward, right? It's not straightforward. Nothing happens after Nuremberg to transform the Soviet legal system. Initially, China is part of an effort. There's actually an international law, an effort afterwards to take these ideas of Nuremberg and to integrate them into Soviet law. And so if you look at the transcripts of the Academy of Sciences Institute of Law, you can see some super interesting discussions late in the year of 1946 going into 47 that Trainin and others are involved in, where they say that we're going to bring these ideas and transform, but that never happens. Instead, what you see is that their individual fates go, like different things happen to them.
Great. We have Professor Kim Lane Shepley next.
Yeah, hi. This is such a fabulous project, and that was a wonderful presentation. And I have a question about sort of the language skills all around, because your Vishinsky story says that many of the other delegations spoke no Russian. So the question was, did any of the Russians speak any other languages? And so when they're hanging out and drinking and socializing and also reviewing all those German documents that are the basis of the trial itself, how involved was the Soviet delegation in any of that if they had limited language skills?
This is a huge, huge issue for the Soviets all the way through. They never have, and so some of the members of the Soviet delegation, we know, like it says, like they knew certain languages, like the alternate Soviet judge, Volchkov, he supposedly knew English, he had spent time in London, but the piles of documents are so enormous that right from the beginning, when you go through the early telegrams as the Soviets are in London and then in Berlin and trying to work through the evidence, it's like plea after plea after plea. Please send translators, please send help, please send someone who can help us to work. So they're at a huge disadvantage from the very start. And some of those telegrams, they predict what's going to happen. They say, if you don't send someone who knows German to help us, we're not going to be able to go through these documents. We're not going to know what's coming. And they also want to be able to read, again, the materials that the other prosecutors are preparing. And they feel themselves at a great disadvantage there as well. So the Soviets, I mean, they do send more translators. They don't send enough. They end up sending translators, people who know German who are already in Berlin with the Soviet military administration there. They send translators, basically agents from Smersh and other branches of the Soviet security apparatus who have been interrogating, I was going to say interviewing, but interrogating the defendants, right, back in Moscow. So some of them end up traveling to Nuremberg with like Erich Raeder and Hans Fritzsche, and then they stay to help the Soviets with their case as well. But it's a nightmare for them. It's a logistical nightmare in terms of the translating of the documents, but then also in terms of they struggle a lot with the interpretation. I would say too, that part of what happens is initially, first of all, they don't understand what the kinds of documents they're going to be. Like the sheer volume of documents takes everybody by surprise. They also don't understand how long the trial is going to go on and how involved it's going to be. And they also think at the beginning, everyone does, and that's because the Americans had actually led them to think this, that the Americans are going to be providing more of the translators because this is being held in the American zone. The Americans are the hosts, but the Americans, they also don't have enough qualified translators, especially of Russian, who they're going to be willing or able to supply. And so the Soviets and the French are told, like in October before the trial starts, that they need to be the ones supplying more translators. And it's so late, but it's a huge issue, a huge issue. I'll mention though too, in terms of as they're hanging out, and there's some great stuff in the memoirs about this, about how some of the Soviet journalists knew a little bit of other languages, right? They had spent a lot of time abroad. Some of them, people like Vishinskys, who's the playwright, he had spent time I think he knew a little bit of French. And so they kind of muddle through, but a lot of the time that they spend, they're also doing things like playing chess and drinking, right? Or they have people kind of helping with some of the translation. So there's a lot of nonverbal communication that happens as well in those informal gatherings.
Great. Our next question is from Manuela, and I can read it here. Do you think it is possible to talk about the beginning of a cultural Cold War in Nuremberg through media attention, referring to the presence of journalists from all over the world, the control that the US had in occupied areas? Can the media transmission of the Nuremberg trial be read as an initial attempt to move Europe in an anti-communist direction? So media coverage.
Yeah, so I mean, the media coverage of Nuremberg is incredibly interesting. And the Soviets, again, so remember in terms of how the media works. So there's so many ways I can go with this question. I'm trying to decide which way I want to go with it. I mean, I'll just say from the start that in terms of figuring out the press camp and how to culturally make things work for themselves in Nuremberg, the Soviets are really struggling, right, at the very beginning, because they don't have an open media system, right? And they don't do things like hold informal press conferences. They don't do things like pre-circulate information. So they try to hold a lot of their information really secret. And Vishnevsky actually ends up taking the lead and arguing that they need to have their own, they need to take, he says that they need to follow the lead of the British and the French and hold these informal press conferences and informal dinners and gatherings in order to be able to better influence how their country is being covered and to influence the coverage of the Nuremberg trials. And so on the ground, as the Nuremberg trials are happening, the Soviets actually, we can kind of see this, that they start to take measures to do this. They do start to hold more informal press conferences, and Vishnevsky has a major role in this. So that's one thing that's happening. Another thing that's happening is that in terms of the coverage that the people in the Soviet Union are getting, right, versus other places in the world, the coverage is really different. In part, the Soviets, every single day, it's a straight up, during the prosecution case, it's a straight up transcript of like key events of the trials. And so they would make this transcript, and then the security forces would sign off and okay it, and then that would go into the press. And they were very careful too in what they were allowed to cover and not cover. They didn't want to have these big stories, like these big human interest stories about the defendants that you had in the Western press. And not only that, but in the Western press, AP they were holding these, quote unquote interviews with the Nazi defendants using their lawyers as intermediaries. And these articles were running in AP, like, Keitel says that, that the war was preventive. Goering says that Soviets really to blame. And the Soviets were furious about this. And the memos on this go all the way up to Stalin and back, right? Stalin is furious about the kind of coverage that this is getting, and the Soviets are supposed to do something. And so they appeal to the tribunal, to the judges, to this is ridiculous. And the judges say, we can't do anything. This is, it's a free media. We can't affect it. So yeah, everything that's happening with the media is hugely important. And I would say that it's I don't know if I would call it a cultural Cold War. That's like a big term, right? But it absolutely affects how the Soviets understand. They're furious about it, about the kind of coverage. And I would say too that during the defense case, it's really interesting. If you read Pravda during the defense case, you'll see there's lots about the defense case that, of course, is not covered for the Soviet press, because the Soviet people don't need to read about Goering and Ribbentrop's excuses for why they did what they did, or their version of the story. And so for a lot of time during the defense case, Pravda and Izvestia are rerunning some of the important facts from earlier in the trial. So the coverage really, it shifts and it's really different. In terms of how the verdicts are covered, I can talk about this all day, but I won't. But in terms of how the verdicts are covered, the Soviets, again, there's lots of great archival material on this, how the Soviets, they're monitoring how the verdicts are being covered all over the world, because they're furious also about the acquittals. And so Stalin, gets these packets of information about different press coverage of this too. So they're watching press coverage very, very carefully back in the Kremlin.
All right, our next question is it's David Binns, you'd raised your hand earlier, and so I had you next in line there. And I see you've put the question in the chat, but would you like to declare it, or shall I read it?
You should be able to unmute yourself. I've asked you to unmute.
Okay, is that better? Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. Yes, I'd like to ask the question, if I may. I'd just introduce myself as someone with no specific academic expertise in this area, but a long-standing interest. I'll declare having a German-Jewish background, which I suppose alerts one to certain issues which keep coming back in different forms throughout life. Now, I have basically a very factual question. It's been a fascinating presentation, by the way, and it's wonderful. It's terrible and wonderful, all rolled into one. I have a very factual question, but which probably has political ramifications. And it was very interesting to hear about this process of the way it was deemed proper to exclude activities and institutions which belonged in the pre-World War II period. So what immediately leapt into my mind, my ill-informed mind about this specific area, was when was the start of World War II posited for the purposes of the tribunal? Now, the reason, what I was thinking of along these lines is, was it a priori excluded that any atrocities, for example, like that of the German Luftwaffe in Guernica in Spain, was this excluded on some kind of a priori basis, or was there any attempt to raise this sort of matter before the formal? I mean, I would understand there would be massive Soviet opposition to that, the question of Spain being raised at that time, and involvement and so on. But that is my basic question. When was it deemed? What was the cutoff point?
Yeah, no, that's so okay. So there's a couple of things in terms of the dating of the war. It's dated to the German invasion of Poland in 1939. So that's right. That's the dating. In terms of the conspiracy charge, for part of it, for the planning and waging of the war, that gets dated to the Hossbach Conference in November 1937, at which Hitler revealed his plans to his generals. And so, but yeah, a lot gets left out, a lot gets excluded. Yeah, and again, I mean, just in terms of I would say the biggest impact of that is with the crimes against humanity charge, of course.
Great, and Olga Buchina? Is next.
Hi, just take a second to unmute myself. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I have a couple of kind of two questions, and half of my question is about the fate of people who came from the Soviet Union as witnesses, like, for example, this poet. What was his story after that? And I'm so sorry that I don't know it. I should know. And a second, I'm a translator myself, what happened to translators, to the Soviet translators who returned back and to the Soviet Union? How many of them actually survived to tell the story? And the second half, I'm reading this book on Nuremberg trial by Philip Sands, which is just translated into Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And I do hope to read your book, and thank you for fantastic presentation, and I do hope it will be in Russian one day too.
It is actually, it's being translated.
Okay,
now.
I'm really happy to hear that. But he's talking a lot about the genocide, the idea of genocide, and what was the Soviet kind of relationship to that term. And because he's discussing kind of Brits and Americans' relation to this term, but I'm very interested what the Soviet delegation thought about it. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah, no, thank you. So in terms of what happens to Sutskever is allowed, he emigrates to Israel. And so there's a lot that's been written about him, and there's a really wonderful movie about him. I think it's called Black Honey. I don't remember right now, but a movie, a film about his life, a documentary. So he ends up emigrating. In terms of many of the other witnesses, they go back to the Soviet Union afterwards, and they live in the Soviet Union. The translators, so again, Stupnikova is the one who we know the most about because of her memoir, and so she publishes her memoir, and and it's an interesting question of what happens to some of the other translators. Many of them survive. I mean, there's little snippets that you get. I did some research about just some of their lives, and you get little snippets online, and some of them end up having a role in some other international conferences afterwards too. The Philip Sands book and the question of genocide. So the question of genocide gets brought in initially in the Nuremberg Charter. It's in the indictment. Genocide is listed as a war crime, right? It's later that it becomes linked with crimes against humanity, and people often think that the Soviets would resist, right, the inclusion of genocide because of, well, for obvious reasons, I guess, in terms of Stalin's policies. But again, remember the London Agreement and the Nuremberg Charter, it's limited to the crimes of the European Axis powers. And so the Soviets, they do not resist the inclusion of genocide. It's sort of a non-issue. But afterwards, as the Cold War is starting, as the Cold War is continuing, I would say, but afterwards in deliberations in the United Nations about genocide, Aaron Trainin, the same lawyer who coined the term crimes against peace, he actually ends up writing a couple of pamphlets and giving talks talking about how we should not be using this term genocide because it's so political. And so the concern for the Soviets, and not just for the Soviets, is what happens if you take this term and afterwards, and there's no longer state sovereignty doesn't matter anymore if you're going to have an international institution and international agreements about genocide. So it's really, really interesting. There's a scholar, Weiss Wendt is his last name, who wrote a book about this question of how genocide is treated in the Soviet Union. That gets into this in a lot of detail and is really interesting.
All right, we have one more here, a source question from Thomas Sniegen. Can you specify the Western sources about Katyn in NBG, please? Was the original German evidence only or more?
Because Western sources back in NBG. Oh,
Tomas or-
Nuremberg. Okay, sorry.
Oh, got it. Okay.
So in terms of the sources that I looked at to get a sense of what was happening at the time, I looked at some of the US and British intelligence materials that was being sent to Jackson and to Sir David Maxwell Fyfe. And so part of what I was able to get about Nuremberg, about Katyn, again, it wasn't, so it's more a question of there were certain witnesses that US intelligence sources like interrogated or who cooperated, who told them things, right? And so that's part of it. There's a really interesting moment where, so Rudenko is pushing really hard to include Katyn in the indictment. And at this point in time, US and American leaders, they have enough evidence coming from the Polish Red Cross and other sources. It's pretty clear that the Soviets did it, okay? But they're not sharing that information. And again, there's a question of who knew what, when, and where, and what did Jackson and others know in Nuremberg. And so Rudenko is pushing really hard to include this, and the Jackson and Sir David Maxwell Fyfe, who's British deputy chief prosecutor, who participates in these discussions, they're saying like, oh, let's just like leave it alone because, no matter who's guilty, it's just going to open up a whole can of worms, right? So like, let's just not touch this. And Rudenko says, my hands are tied. If we're not going to include this, I'm going to have to go back to Moscow and talk to Stalin personally about it. It's going to take a couple of weeks and hold things up. And they agonize about this, and eventually they let it in. It's 2 days after the indictment is published that Jackson gets more intelligence from, and I forget exactly which organization at this sends this telegram, but basically saying like, the Soviets did it. And it's too late. And they say, maybe you could get Rudenko to not talk too much about it during the trial to kind of let it go. But of course, he's not going to let it go. So those are really, those intelligence sources on the US and British side are very interesting in terms of getting a little bit, there's still a lot of questions, right? But to getting a little bit more of a sense of those details.
If there are other questions, I encourage you to put them in the chat. In the meantime, I would like to pose one if I could. I thought that, I have two sets. One of them, I think one of the things the book does so beautifully is that it presents these tensions that the Soviets are dealing with that ultimately go unresolved, that have to, like tensions between legality and sovereignty in particular was one of the big ones that I was struck by. And I was struck in particular at a very small moment about this. And so my question had to do with the Soviet reaction to the verdicts, which you touched on briefly in your talk. And specifically, I was really struck by the moment when Nikitchenko is getting his directions for how to try to shape the verdict that is clearly coming down, not in the way that they want. And I was struck by the weakness of Soviet levers of power at this moment, basically. And so I was interested in the ways in which maybe you saw this theme explored elsewhere in how the Soviets are managing or grappling with the constraints of this setting. To what extent were these constraints related to the balance of power, the dynamics among the four players? And to what extent were they imposed by the setting in the sense of this being a legal process that the Soviets had expressed a commitment to engaging in? And so I was wondering if you could say more about the impressions you have of the Soviet engagement with rule of law through this process. And this is big. But so I'm going from this very small moment to this very big question about the attitudes toward the impositions that the legal process was putting on them and how they dealt with that.
Okay, this is really rich, and there are lots of different ways I can go, so I'm gonna take it from a few different angles. I'm gonna just start with this question of legal process, because one of the things about Nuremberg, right, it's a four-power trial. It integrates aspects, supposedly, of four different legal systems. And when it came to the legal systems themselves, the Americans and the British, right, with common law system, they were much more, they were used to a certain kind of a trial, right? And the British and the French with the civil law system. Now, the Soviets, of course, have all kinds of things like, show trial, this and that added onto it. So we're not talking about a pure civil law system in the Soviet context, but again, the Soviets and the French in terms of civil law, they have much more in common in terms of how they understand how things are going to work. And then this comes in from the start, right, in all kinds of ways in terms of what their expectations are for how things are going to happen. The Soviets think that the indictment is going to include all the evidence, right? And the Americans and the British want evidence to be produced in court. And of course, that's going to then have a major disadvantage, right, for the Soviets who aren't used to that kind of adversarial courtroom. I mean, to the extent that they are, it's in a show trial where they have control over the whole thing. So to have defense attorneys whose job it is to really, to really argue against the evidence, that's very, very difficult for them. And we see that throughout the defense case where the Soviet prosecutors, they end up making these like lengthy speeches and denunciations instead of actually engaging with the evidence. So that comes in. There's also things too, just in terms of the relationship between the prosecutor and the judge, which in a civil law system is much more cooperative than in common law. So again, just in terms of the legal expectations, the Soviets they don't fully grasp how things are going to run initially, right? There's that. But then of course there is this expectation that the Soviets have that this is going to be like very straightforward and a show trial kind of thing. And we can say show trial even in a very neutral way, a sense of like didactic justice, of demonstrating, right, Nazi guilt before the world. And before the trial started, I mean, that's what they thought they were getting into. And that seemed to be the general gist of things. It shifts. It shifts when Truman comes in. It shifts with Jackson and what his then aspirations are for using the trial to demonstrate rule of law and American values, right? Because initially the Soviets are pushing for trial and the British just want an executive degree, and something behind closed doors. And the Soviets say, they want to shoot them too or hang them, but they want a trial first. And the Americans are, ambivalent about like what is this going to look like? And so again, once the Americans determine that this is going to demonstrate rule of law and American values, and this is part of what Jackson wants to do, then there becomes a real struggle to shape how the trial itself works. And the Soviets, they thought that the Americans, again, they're going to go last. So it's the Americans, the British, the French, and the Soviets in terms of evidence. They thought that the Americans would take a couple of weeks, and then the Americans go on for a couple of months. And they're not expecting that either. And the Americans start to call witnesses, and they think that all the witnesses are going to be called at the end. So they're constantly having to adjust their expectations. And again, you add on to having to constantly adjust expectations with issues with translation and issues with communication because of Moscow's expectations. So they're always five steps behind just because of having to play catch up. And that is a problem throughout. I wanted that you mentioned in terms of the judgment. I just talk a little bit about that because that was one of the most interesting documents that I found in the archives. And so just again to set the stage here, the judges are meeting in Nuremberg they have this meetings all along, but then in September, they have all these meetings behind closed doors. And the American, the US, the memoirs and everything that's been written about it makes so much of the fact that like they were sequestered and they were meeting in private, and how they would take the trash out and burn it every night, right? And then you see a copy of the draft judgment in Moscow, and you're like, okay, that worked really well. And so this, and it circulates, right? Because Nikitchenko himself, he doesn't have also the same education and the same knowledge of the law as the Western judges. So he's also at a disadvantage there because of that too. Training's helping him out, right? Behind closed doors. And so then things in Moscow, you have this judgment that circulates, and then you have like all the members of the security apparatus that are commenting on it, and Molotov is commenting on it, and then Stalin gets to see it, and they end up sending back like too late, not that how much good would it have done anyway, but too late, a 12-page encrypted telegram to Nikitchenko with very specific directives about how to, also that basically that, all of them should hang, but if we have to compromise, here's where you can compromise and give in a little bit, and here's where you can't compromise, right? Because this is how they're used to doing things. They think that this is going to be effective, but it's not at all. And yeah, so it's a combination of the legal systems and what they think that everyone has agreed to, and then what the trials turn into, and just this inability to control things.
Thank you. We have a question here. Stephen Kotkin is coming at us with a question about the category of the Soviets. That I assume he'll expound on that, but perhaps not. Perhaps that's all you need.
Thank you for the presentation. I should add, for everyone who doesn't know, the book is as good as the presentation just was that you saw. So I encourage everyone to read the book as well. So there's an asymmetry in the agency of the participants, obviously. Some of them feel empowered to act in their capacity as experts, professionals, officials, and quote, the Soviets are a different delegation and have a different agency here, as you've described the details. So is there a category, the Soviets at Nuremberg, given that they didn't have the kind of agency that their counterparts had? How would we understand the agency asymmetry at Nuremberg?
So I'm trying to say if I understand it, but first of all, there is tremendous asymmetry in terms of the kinds of decision-making that the amount of power that the prosecutor and the judge have, like vis-a-vis Moscow. But those who are in Nuremberg, the Soviets, like the Soviet judge still gets a vote, right? The Soviet prosecutor still can hold things up. He can hold up the trial and insist on pushing through the indictment. So I would say, pushing Katyn into the indictment. So there are lots of ways in which they shape what happens. So it's not where they don't have agency. So is there something else in terms of, I guess, what do you mean exactly in terms of agency? Is there something else that you're getting at?
Yes, so of course they have agency, but it's not the same agency.
No.
And so that's why I'm trying to wonder how we compare their agency to the others, and whether or not we use the category of the Soviets. We can use the category of the Americans and the British, I think, with less complication, because they weren't sending back encrypted telegrams asking what to do. They were themselves enacting their professional point of view. And so the Soviet case, the Soviets, there's a tyrant and there's et cetera, et cetera. So the category isn't equivalent to the Americans or the British and the French. And it's come up in many of your answers to the questions, this differentiated quality of the agency.
Right. I guess I tend to think visually sometimes. And as you were talking, I was imagining like a caricature of each of the delegations and what it might look like. And so I would imagine, in terms of the American delegation, like Jackson, like out in front, like just, full charge with the members of his team, like all around him. And they're with some anti-communist propaganda even, and a flag, and they know what they're doing, right? With the British, again, it's, the friend of the Americans, right? In the sense that the Americans and the British, they often, but not always agree. And there are ways in which, because the Americans are hosting things, even the British are a bit deferential to them in terms of some of the arrangements. So I would see, Sir David Maxwell Fyfe with the members of the British there, and, they're drinking some tea and they're very calm. And, the French, that's complicated too. And I didn't talk much about the French today, but they're very quiet, actually. They come in at key moments, and And I would say they're the ones who actually get outvoted the most, because the French are the ones who all along are pushing for an expansion of the charges to cover things that happened before the war, and for the charges to not be limited by concerns about state sovereignty. So, I imagine that the French, I imagine, Devab, the judge, and the prosecutor, like just looking very dapper with all their pile of legal books, like trying to instill more law into the process. And the Soviets, yeah, I imagine like Rudenko and Nikitchenko, like in a closed room, like with like a giant picture of Stalin and like hanging onto the phone line. So, and so they bring all of these things to the table. So I would say like, yeah, there are like, there's the Soviets, but that's part of what you get. And when people joke about, like in Nuremberg, when people talk about the different delegations, and again, one of the things about looking at letters and other kinds of materials is that you also get a sense of how all the delegations like see each other. And that's kind of also how the other delegations see the Soviets. Like they understand that they have to wait for direction. There's a crazy episode right before the trials are going to start where they're 10 steps behind and really not ready, and they want to delay the start of the trials. And so what do? They say that Rudenko has malaria. And so they want to wait for a while. And so, when you look at then the Western material, like they're talking about like, well, he has, malaria of the diplomatic type, but like, what are we going to do with it? And in the Soviet materials, they're all talking about like consultations with Rudenko's doctor. And you know who the doctor is, right? So it's not the Westerners versus the Soviets, but it's instead what each, the certain characteristics that each of the delegations brings to the table. It's interesting to think about. Thank you.
Leap back in. I was enjoying the exchange. Unless we have any further questions, going once. Going twice. I'm going to thank Professor Hirsch wholeheartedly for this wonderful presentation and for the excellent book. I've already taught with it, and I recommend that all of you teach and learn from it too. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you for having me. This was a lot of fun. Thanks. This was great.